Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
You're listening to the Reversing Climate Change podcast by the team at Nori, the carbon removal marketplace. This is a show about the innovators and entrepreneurs developing solutions to climate change.
Okay, we've already started the show, kinda, as you can hear. I'm Ross Kenyon. I'm one of the co-founders of the Nori carbon removal marketplace based in Seattle, Washington. Here with Siobhan Montoya Lavender, who's one of the founders of Thanks a Ton, longtime air miner, carbon remover personality. Have you been described as a personality before?
This is a first. This is a first for me. I'll take it.
Keep my notes in front of me. This is what happens. Okay.
Joining us today is Amie Engerbretson, and she's a professional skier, a host, a documentarian who recently created the film The Hypocrite, which explores the interplay between our own individual actions and systemic change when it comes to climate impact. Welcome, Amie.
Hi, thank you for having me. I appreciate being on the show.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. We actually had, I like the whole office at Nori watched The Hypocrite. I made a catered lunch preparing for the Tamar Adler podcast. So everyone ate lamb and watched you call yourself a hypocrite. So that was
sounds like a hypocritical lunch.
Very much was. I really like the tone of it. I think people should probably start with the as a person who feels guilty quite often and someone who's intellectually attracted to Christianity, I like self-flagellation. I like feeling guilty. I like feeling like a hypocrite in a weird, self-aggrandizing kind of way. It feels good in a way, to the act of contrition. You know, it's like, I don't know. How did you feel about making it? Why did you do it? I respect that you framed it this way, but it must have been a hard thing to call yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that question of why I made this film has been coming up a lot lately. And I guess like one of the answers is insanity. But I have been, so I'm a professional skier. I'm a big mountain skier, and that entails traveling quite constantly to find snow. It entails riding chairlifts. It definitely entails heli skiing now and then. And recently in my career, it entails using the use of a snowmobile for a lot of access for a lot of the filming we do. But also being a professional skier, living in the mountains, growing up in the mountains, traveling to the mountains of the world, spending time in Alaska, spending time around glaciers, you know, living in the Sierras with the cumbersome smoke and wildfire situation. Like, the realities of climate change have not, they've been very present in my life, really obvious. And I kind of am one of those people who for a long time, you know, I knew this was happening. I kind of felt like I was contributing to it, but it must not have been that bad. Or I was just kind of scared to like activate. And like, if you would have met me like 6 years ago, if you told me like, hey, in the future, you're going to call yourself a climate advocate, I would have like literally gone, ick, like, no, not me. I'm not like a sciencey person. I'm not a political person. And more than anything, I'm not a perfect person. You know, I had this idea that to care about the environment, you had to be this really perfect like thing that I had in my mind of like what a perfect and like environmentalist looked like. And I wasn't that, you know, and not only that, so, you know, when you're a professional athlete and you have a platform, that's what everyone likes to say, I was starting to feel pressure to like use my platform for good, but then again, still like not feeling good enough to do so, right? Like, I'm not perfect. I wasn't ready to like give up my ski career. I wasn't ready to become a foot-powered only athlete. And I was just very conflicted about that, you know, like I felt like I just had to be quiet and keep my head down and not talk about the issue, even though I saw it happening. I cared about it. I was really concerned. And so kind of the story really begins with like my coming to like being an advocate first, right? Like I kind of had to get into that space before I could make a film like this. And, you know, it was around 2016 when I saw my world changing and I saw leadership changing in a way that like freaked me out, where I kind of just had this, you know, to go to the Christian reference, like this kind of come to Jesus moment of like, okay, Amy, like you are somebody who is influential in your community. You're constantly influencing people to buy more skis or go skiing here, do all these things. Like you need to also counteract that with like some good. And like you need to kind of face this fear and intimidation you have and see what your role is here. And that's when I started getting pretty activated with this company, Protect Our Winters, that they are this really cool organization kind of organizing in the outdoor space for climate action. And from there, it was like kind of this snowball effect, for lack of a better analogy, is like the more I learned about what was happening with our climate, but more like what was happening to obstruct something being done about it. And the more I was learning about why we were thinking the way we were thinking and why things were not working or working the way they were, like I just kept having these aha moments and being really empowered. And I was getting way down this path of being like a climate advocate, but at the same time, I was getting more and more into snowmobiling, and my ski career was not dwindling, it was progressing, and I'm traveling more and using helicopters more. And so I had this like life where I was like, felt so hypocritical, because it's not just that like my life as an individual was potentially carbon intensive. It was that I was glorifying it publicly to all these people that followed me, that watched the movies I'm in. You know, a lot of what I do is make these ski movies that get you all hyped up at the beginning of the season to go heli skiing in Alaska, you know? So it's even worse than just me personally going heli skiing. It's me glorifying. And so I had the idea for the film rolling around in my head for like 4 years. And it took me about that long to essentially muster up the confidence to dive into the problem and make the movie. And so the film got started. I applied for a grant with Protect Our Winters in the spring of 2022. And then the fall of 2022, I got word that I received the grant, and there was like this huge part of me that was like, oh my God, now I have to make this movie. What did I sign myself up for? So yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to make the film because I kind of wanted others to come on this journey with me of learning that potentially the way I was thinking, the way I was feeling, that was causing me to be so kind of just paralyzed on the whole situation or apathetic about the whole situation. Like a lot of the ways I was thinking and feeling turns out are the product of millions, if not billions, of advertising dollars that were influencing how the public was thinking about these problems. And to me, the more I learned about the issues, why we were where we were, and what the potential, for change was, the more inspired I got. So I wanted to make a film that would hopefully bring people like along that same journey, and especially people in my community. And when I say my community, I kind of mean the ski and snowboard world, but what I really mean is like the outdoor community, like everybody that participates in outdoor sports.
Okay. I love that ethos. Okay, I have a question for you to kind of frame the backdrop of this documentary and your role in it. You're a skier. Mm-hmm. Here we are, we're recording this right now, second half of winter. It's the season, in the Northern Hemisphere anyways. And could you kind of paint us a picture of what a professional day looks like for you and kind of what it means to you and why you choose this?
Yeah. So I am talking to you guys from Lake Tahoe, California, and we are in between storms right now. We had a big storm last week, and we have a huge storm coming this week, which everybody's like, it's snowing, there's no climate change. And obviously climate's not weather, but these extreme weather events like we've been having, especially here where I live in Tahoe, just growing up here, I've seen the way our winters change so much. The length of our winters, the fluctuating snow lines, the intensity of winds, what that does to avalanche cycles, like it's crazy. But yeah, for me as a big mountain skier, I don't do the Olympics or race gates. There are big mountain competitions that I did when I was younger, but those are for young people with young knees. I'm by no means old, but those things take a toll on you for sure. And so I spend my winter making films about skiing or doing magazine articles and things like that. And then I work really closely with my sponsors on product development, a lot of product testing and product development. And like a midwinter day, today was a training day and an admin day, a lot of computer work in professional skiing, believe it or not. But coming up here with this storm cycle, a lot of my days, like a film day will be, up at about 4 a.m. and getting the gear together, usually out the door well before the light comes out, and then dealing with, managing all the hazards of the day. I pay very close attention to weather and avalanche conditions. I do a lot of my work in the backcountry, which is outside the bounds of a ski resort. Sometimes hiking to it, sometimes using my snowmobile to get to it, sometimes using a helicopter, but not usually. That's what I'm up in Canada or in Alaska. And so it's about you kind of usually have a crew of about 2 to 3 athletes. You have a couple of filmers, maybe a photographer, and you usually have a pretty set plan before the day where you have some objectives, a lot like what I'm going to do tomorrow, for example, knowing there's a big storm coming in. I'm going to go out my snowmobile and I'm going to do some reconnaissance work. So I'm going to go out to some of the zones I want to film. I'm going to see what the snow's looking like, how filled in things are, if there's any avalanche concerns to be worried about. And so like there's a lot of planning. If you go watch any of my movies or anything like that, you just see this glorious, oh my God, she's always just skiing pow and jumping off cliffs, but there's like a lot of work that goes into it. And then those days in the field when we're filming, usually really long days, usually out of the house well before the sun comes up and back to the house way after the sun's down. And we work as a team out there. We spend a lot of time assessing the safety of situations. I know people are like, you're just fling yourself off everything. And it's like, well, no, it's a lot of really calculated decision making and things to take into account. But I like to say, like in the winter this time of year, like even when we were trying to schedule this podcast, it's like, well, my life is dominated by Mother Nature. And so it's really hard for me to make plans outside the 5-day window because that's when the weather forecast gets fairly reliable to a point. And so I've really just I've been this professional skier for about 15 some odd years now. I grew up here in Lake Tahoe. My dad was a professional skier in the 90s and the late 80s. And then he became a filmer and photographer in the ski space and then went on to other spaces. And so growing up somewhere like Tahoe, like to a lot of people, being like a professional skier sounds really cool and interesting. But around here, it's just like run of the mill. Like I'm in the family business, basically. So it's been kind of my whole life. I'm not sure what keeps me coming back to it. I think that there's this amazing gift that I get in this like freedom of exploring my own limits and boundaries and like what's possible for me that I think is really cool. And I get to do it in a really visceral, physical way, which I think every person in their life has an experience of pushing their boundaries and their limits. But when you get to be an athlete working in the elements, in Mother Nature, in the mountains with your body, like it's just there's a lot of disappointment and heartbreak that comes with it for sure. Like I often say no to things more than I say yes. And there's a lot of fear. And I've had some really bad accidents in my career, but there's also that like exhilarating feeling when things do line up and you're getting to like feel that true expression of like yourself in an environment that's outside of your control. It's a freedom that I've never experienced in any other walk of life, but I think maybe I was just raised to be addicted to it. So here I am.
Are there people, I'm sure there are plenty of professional winter sports athletes who don't think about this at all. Are there people who are very strict about what they will allow themselves to do in with a climate change perspective? Are there some that like maybe they look at you and say, that's cool that you're a hypocrite, but you could also just get an electric snowmobile, which might not exist yet or whatever, or maybe just cut out helicopters. Like, I don't know, sorry to put it directionally like this, but do you face leftward pressure on climate activism from your peers? Is there anyone out there like that who's still nudging?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. And I think with like releasing the film and I kind of foresaw this happening, that I feel like we're actually feeling the most pressure from like a far left perspective on climate and environmentalism and like that more traditional approach. And there was definitely like a big movement with a lot of with Protect Our Winters in general, but a lot of professional athletes in the 2010s of like declaring yourself a foot powered only athlete and staying local and not traveling. And I even have a friend who's a professional snowboarder here in the Tahoe area, Tim Eddy, and he like went as far as to like give up riding resort. He moved to a cabin totally off grid. They were completely vegan. Like he was doing the whole thing. And I think, and again, veganism and vegetarianism is very prevalent like in the culture. And I think there's a lot of people And it's not just other athletes, it's like brands too. Like I recently switched sponsors for outerwear this year. And even with brands, they're like, oh, well, we're really focusing on sustainability, so we don't sign athletes that use snowmobiles or go heli skiing, or if they do, we don't show it. And so it's definitely a big thing that's been present in the industry for a long time, kind of in the core of it, I would say, like with the pros and the industry people. And I think that's why for a long time I was very hesitant to really put my hat in the ring and get and for the record, I can't wait till we have a functional mountain electric sled. They do have e-sleds out. You're seeing a lot of resorts switch over their resort fleets to e-sleds, like for during the X Games, for example, which is a big freestyle competition in Aspen. All of the snowmobiles used for that were electric. So that technology is coming, right? It's not there for the kind of snowmobile that I use to access the mountains the way I do. But it's not that I am anti those things at all. And it's not that I think one of the things we're seeing with the film is this potential criticism of like I actually don't care about the carbon I burn. I actually absolutely do. I really, really do. And I can't wait till there's a time where I can make some life choices that are reasonable to affect that change. Right now, a lot of those options, for example, a functional EV in the mountains isn't in my price range. I drive a 15-year-old Subaru. So, I think that what I kind of learned is that, and even through like that guy, Tim, the snowboarder's experience, what he even learned and was really affecting to talk to him about is that if I go totally off grid and live my life in a cave, that's great. I am affecting my carbon input, but I'm not affecting my sphere of influence in the same way that I could be if I continue on with my career as a professional athlete and being mindful about it. I'm not just like, oh, I'm going to recklessly burn as much carbon as possible. It's just, I don't feel healthy as a vegetarian. I don't, like that's, and I also just know that so many of these things, when you look at the grander scale of like the changes and the things that need to happen to make a big impact, a lot of those things aren't really what's moving the needle. And that pressure to be so perfect and fit in that box is what keeps a lot of people out of the club of advocating for it and pushing. And, Powell has this concept that I talk about in the film of the outdoor state. And it's that if you round up all the people in the US that participate in outdoor recreation, you get a number of well over 50 million people, but we're using 50 million as like our benchmark, right? And the idea is that if that whole community could unify around action on climate, that we would have this amazing political juggernaut that could totally go up against these things that we think are behemoths like the fossil fuel industry. The reality is that the outdoor industry, and a big net here, I'm talking about hook and bullet, I'm talking about camping, I'm not talking about ball sports, but like all outdoor rec, that industry contributes annually to the GDP double what the fossil fuel industry extraction portion of it contributes to the GDP. So we think like the fossil fuel industry is this huge unpenetrable industry, and the outdoor industry, the part of the industry that I'm a part of, that I influence, is actually a bigger industry. It's actually bigger than the pharmaceutical industry as well. And so I think that when we are constantly telling people like do less, be less, it's really hard, because the other reality is that this idea of thinking about or affecting your individual carbon footprint is such a privilege that's very much only available to a certain class of person in a certain walk of life. And it's absolutely not available to the people that are going to be very disproportionately affected by climate change. So we need those solutions to be equitable and systemic so that like everybody has access to them, not just this white privileged woman in a mountain town,
So in watching the film, you talked to Naomi Oreskes about this, about how the idea of the carbon footprint was a PR campaign by oil and gas. And I think some people might experience the telling of that as a way of saying, I don't need to try. But I think a lot of environmentalists, they want to feel and they want to expect of their peers that you are trying, even if obviously individually what you do, if you live or die, climate change is going to happen or not happen, and it doesn't really matter because it's so much bigger than any one person. But they almost want to see the thing happen in your heart. And so it might make people frustrated because you might not be doing as much as you can, even though the result will not impact anything, but are sort of pointing the blame in a different direction. And I think it's because it isn't just about solving climate change to some of these people. I think it all is almost like a spiritually transformative moment, or that's what they want to see, and you're denying that to them. Siobhan, do you agree with me? I feel like, am I just like, this is so speculative?
It's speculative. First of all, I just want to point out that the way you framed it was maybe questioning whether or not like where footprints came from. It's a very known fact. I think sometimes it gets swept under the rug, but within climate communities, I think it's a pretty known fact that yes, the concept of calculating your own footprint was developed by BP, British Petroleum. And yeah, I think there's been a thousand think pieces penned on this, but that I think the consensus is it was to deviate attention, right? It was to deviate attention away from the fossil fuel industry onto personal responsibility. So I think this is a topic that's been going on since that happened, right? Consumer demand was a big thing that people talked about, and how that actually does impact systemic change, even though it is an individual decision. But then everyone's like, but at the end of the day, like we live in a carbonized world, right? We live in a carbonized world where we don't have choices. There was a guy in your film who said, who said, he's like, I'm pissed that this is my only option. Like this thing that brings me so much joy and sustenance in life, this is my only option. There's a future we could envision where there are different options. I'm curious to Ross's point though. I think there is almost this, we see this in all sorts of environmental communities, almost like a tithing, do you think, Ross? Or like this idea that like
it's like independent of the results almost. Yeah.
I'm curious if your criticism that you received before the film was higher or lower. I mean, the film's, I guess, just coming out, so it's still new in the zeitgeist. But I'm curious if the criticism is higher or lower, or like where you think the criticism came from. Was it mostly online? Was it face-to-face? Where were people talking about this?
Yeah, well, yeah. So the film has been publicly released for about a week now, so we're still gathering all of that. And definitely, the majority of the criticism is very clearly from people, not just online, but specifically on social media, who very clearly haven't watched the film. And that's just the reality of social media that we live in, right? The
earnest film too. Like I feel like I've been calling it this and discussing it in this way is supposed to diffuse some of this. One would hope. It doesn't seem like it worked though. So.
I think it is diffusing some of it. I think that I think to your point of like there is this like identity. I mean, let's first start with this. It's a both and situation. It's not a this or that. It is a both and. We need systemic changes, and we as individuals have to live examined lives and adjust our lives accordingly. There's not reasonable solutions to make all these better choices from right now. I believe that they exist out there, and with redirection of subsidies and funding and research and emphasis, we can create those solutions and those options and to make better choices from. So it's not a either or, it's definitely a yes and I'm never saying that there's, every little ounce of carbon absolutely matters. It's just about looking at where you can have the biggest effect, and that's like as individuals, maybe not professional athletes like me with Instagram followers and the ability to make movies, but like we're all part of communities, we're all part of local governments, we're all part of all of these systems that we touch that I think it's not popular to activate on. And I think when you talk to like the criticism we're getting from kind of what I'm calling maybe more of like a traditional environmentalist perspective, I don't know if this is the right word for it, but this is what I'm starting to feel, is that I think there is quite a bit of like ego wrapped into it and identity. And like so much of the polarization in our world is wrapped up in identities being wrapped up in something that like doesn't even mean the same thing that it used to, especially like when you look at like political parties and stuff. And so I think it is hard to challenge someone's identity, right? Because then you're challenging someone's ego in a way, which is always going to be touchy. But I do believe that the person that is maybe judging a motorized recreational user, I think that judgment is still pandering to what the fossil fuel industry kind of wants us to do. Like, I think a good example, so my film kind of uses the example of the foot-powered ski industry versus the snowmobile motorized community. And I think those kind of rifts exist in a lot of different ways. And that's just the example that I'm a part of. And so I'm using that as like the paintbrush for this bigger issue, because obviously the issue is definitely not snowmobiles. We could eradicate snowmobiles and really wouldn't make a difference. But that, like, that judgment, you know, I think the fossil fuel industry does want us to be so busy fighting about who gets to use the forest that we don't notice that the forest is burning down, right? And there's this person that's directing that. I mean, there's a lot of stats that we had worked up through the film. One of them that's really amazing is you would have to live 58 million years as an individual to emit in one lifetime what Shell emitted in 2023 alone. Like that, those, when you start comparing, and I went through my carbon calculations of myself, where I compared my carbon footprint in this last year of being a professional athlete and making this film and flying to Europe, using a snowmobile, going on one heli trip. And my carbon footprint was actually half the size of the average ski town resident carbon footprint. And it was only 1 ton of carbon higher than the average American's annual carbon footprint. But I compared that. So that number was 27 metric tons of carbon. I compared that number to the carbon reduction that will exist in 1 year of the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was 5 billion. And so you're comparing these numbers, like I'm comparing 27 to 5 billion, you know, and even when we scale that, like it's not comparable. And I think another really interesting stat I found that we weren't able to work into the film, but if the IEA has this big report, the International Environmental Agency has this big report about what we need to do to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, all the things that need to happen. Of all those things that need to happen, the IEA states that 4% of those things are individual behavior based.
Wow.
Which those kind of stats, like, and everybody questions them, wants to see the science. And there's a lot of people quoting the most recent IPCC to me in this moment of like, well, the IPCC, the most recent one says that influencers and thought organizers and community leaders can lead by example by reducing their carbon footprint. And a lot of people are stopping there. I had a scientist, Greg Nemeth, who wrote part of the IPCC, worked on the IPCC for years in my film. The and to that statement, yes, influential people like myself, community leaders, can influence people to, through purchasing power, through lifestyle decisions, live a less carbon intensive life. And individual action alone is not enough to address this issue in the time frame that we need to address it. We need systemic, political will-oriented, major scale policy changes. And so even you see the IPCC, which is kind of like our globally agreed upon, you know, rule book for like what we're doing here, acknowledging this both and part of this issue. And I think that when we focus only on the individual, like that shame and that guilt is so paralyzing. And I feel like the biggest issue, you know, in my community, the outdoor community we face is apathy. A lot of people are like, hey, my time on the trail, on the chairlift, like out in nature, this is my me time. This is my escape time. Don't talk to me about the news. Don't bring your politics onto the chairlift. Like, I don't want to hear it. And I think the reality is we don't have that luxury anymore. If you still want to do these things, you need to get involved in this game. And what I really hope in like starting this conversation is to create a little bit more space in the middle, right? For more people to realize that they can be part of this conversation. You don't have to be perfect to be part of this conversation. There's potential for our community to drive really impactful change, but to just make space for that unity and to lay down the finger pointing and the judgment and the blaming and the shaming and really come together to drive those changes in a major way, like to make it in my community like part of what I do is influence people, and a lot of what I do is wrapped up in consumerism, and I'm very aware of that, right? Convincing people to buy these skis or go skiing here or whatever. But I also can influence my community to be like, to be a member of this community, you need to be a citizen. Like, that's the benchmark, is like, if you like it, you care about it, you want to continue this passion in your life and in your generations of your family's lives to come, like, you need to be a citizen. And it's cool to engage civically. Like, how do I make it cool to be civically engaged? How do I make it cool to show up at a town council meeting? How do I make it cool to know who your county commissioner is? You know, not everybody gets to go to DC and lobby the way I have. But there's so much else we can do. And even in the companies we work for, like, yes, my job is to sell skis, but I'm also working with my ski sponsor, Atomic, where we're really addressing the life cycle of the skis and the products, and we're figuring out how to do that. You know, this year they had a lot of their skis come down up to 27% in their life cycle analysis for their carbon footprint, which is a meaningful thing in 1 year. You know, so I think it's really easy to, I don't know, like, it's like judging a book by the cover a little bit, I think, is what we're facing. And I think it's people's identity. And I think I set myself up for a tough week on the internet, I can tell you that much, because I'm getting it from both sides, right? Like, and I know that, but what I'm trying to do is, I feel like there's so many people in the middle that are lost. Well, and that's who I want to talk to, you know?
So, like, skiing is okay. But I think choosing snowmobilers are easy to hate. And I realize I'm saying this publicly in a way that puts me in a precarious spot, but I will explain. I grew up in Mesa, Arizona, and a lot of my neighbors were, they were people who maybe came from the lower middle class, but became wealthy. They were contractors, people who were skilled tradespeople, and they bought dune buggies and quads and dirt bikes. And my parents kind of looked down on them. My parents were like, we go to London on vacation. They're all like, we load up the dune buggies and we go to Rocky Point and we get drunk and listen to Jimmy Buffett for a week straight. And my parents were like, you couldn't pay me enough money to do that. That sounds awful. And I don't know if snowmobiling has that same association. I don't know to what degree class is influencing that more than just it's a loud thing and I don't like it. But I feel like I have that association. I don't know if that carries over to snowmobiles in the same way. Does it?
I think it absolutely does. And I think that's part of why I think using the snowmobile, it is a really polarizing symbol in my community. And I think other people can relate to that. I think that when I got into snowmobiling, I had a lot of the same preconceived notions, like all these people must be super Republican. And if I show up in my Subaru with my California plates, they're going to hate me. And
did they?
they had questions.
So, yeah.
They had questions, but there was actually more respect in it than you would thought. And I kind of thought getting into the snowmobile community, I was going to be met with that kind of person. And I also felt like I wasn't going to be welcomed. And I had the experience of kind of putting myself in a new community. And I was really surprised because the interactions I was having with people at the trailheads, but especially like out in the field, was so surprising. There's this culture in the snowmobile world. And I think this is like a middle America small town culture thing that like we overlook as people that live on the coasts and in big cities, of like this help your neighbor thing. And it was so amazing. Like when I've been out backcountry skiing and I am struggling with my skin, or the skin track is slippery and I'm struggling, people like kind of buzz by you and are like, oh, beat it, kook, like learn how to skin or whatever. Like there's a lot of condescending.
I have no idea what you're talking about, but
just like the way you're on the trails, like, I don't know, backcountry skiers are very like competitive to like get to their zone, get there first. And like, there's a lot of, and I kind of assumed the snowmobile community would be the same way, but going out as snowmobiling is actually a very difficult physical skill that I had to learn. And I'm still learning. I'm still pretty bad at it. But so I'd be out, deep in the field, way out in the woods. And I would have my, snowmobile completely stuck in like a tree well. All the time, actually. This happens all the time. And a whole group of like pro snowmobilers and their big fancy brand new snowmobiles like roll up. And rather than like going by and being like, look at you, you're an idiot, you're in a tree well, you shouldn't have gone there. Everybody stops, takes off their helmet. What can we do? Oh, we've had this kind of stuff before. Like there's this community of like camaraderie and help that's like baked into their culture. Like part of their day in the woods is helping other people. And that was like kind of an aha moment to me, where I had to face my own like judgment in the space. And that to me is kind of something that like, I think, yeah, it's easy. Like, oh, they're loud and they're disrespectful because they're loud, so I don't like them. And it's kind of like, well, like, is that true? And you probably don't like them until you're out there and you're hurt or you have an equipment malfunction, and then they can get you help really fast. Or, I think there's a lot of people think that where a snowmobile wants to go and where a backcountry skier wants to go are the same places, and they're really not. There's some crossover at the beginnings of trailheads, but I think it's like what comes first, the chicken or the egg. At some point, there's been judgment and distrust between the user groups, so there's a mutual disrespect, and at some point, somebody has to pass out an olive branch and be like, "Look, let's just." I don't want to go snowmobiling. I don't like it. It is loud and it's not my thing, but how can we just get along here? And you go that way and I go this way. And, maybe what radio channel are you on? Because if I have a huge problem or an incident in the backcountry, maybe I'll flag you and you can come help me. Like, can we get to that place? And I think, I've had that experience with the Razor side-by-sides mountain biking in Moab, where they're just like loud and it makes it dusty and then I can't breathe and then I'm annoyed. But it's like, I don't know. I guess I had this other experience that was really affecting in this way of, trying to find some respect for, like, who am I to judge how you recreate? Like, where do I get off doing that? Like, where do I get off judging what kind of music you listen to or what you think is fun or any of those things? And I was with Protect Our Winters in DC lobbying for the first time. I was very nervous. I felt very, very out of place in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill in a rented pantsuit. I can tell you that. Almost as scared as like on the top of some like big ski lines, right? I'm like, what am I doing here? I don't belong here. I am so freaked out. And we had a meeting with a Republican congressman from Florida. And I was like, oh my God, like what? This is going to be so bad. What are we going to talk about? He's going to hate me. He's going to get angry. Like, we're trying to talk about climate change. He's going to like, I was just so nervous and so scared and I didn't know how it was going to go. And so we go into the meeting, and at Protect Our Winters, we've done a lot of like training on how to talk about climate change and how to talk about like stories and emotions. And so we kind of like went in leading with that. And I realized once I got talking to this guy, this Republican from Florida, right? Like, how different could he be? He started talking about his experience in the Everglades. I've never been to Florida. I don't know anything about the Everglades. No idea. But I could see in his eyes when he was talking about those days with his family out there, that like same thing that I love when I'm out in the mountains skiing. And like, he could kind of see that in me. And it was this place where we could really like level set and connect. And from there have like this wildly productive conversation, which caught me totally off guard. And so I think, I don't know, I think I've had all these like little experiences along the way where it's like, to me, like, maybe it's altruistic, I don't know, but this unity in this community that I am part of and that maybe I'm influential in, if we could use that, like, kind of that common, like, literal common ground of, like, the outdoors and how essential being outside and being in nature is to, like, living and enjoying life. And again, I know I'm saying all this with so much privilege, but, like, that is, like, a unifier and a common ground where maybe our passion for these places and these playgrounds could be strong enough to overcome some of these major differences. For me, it's a very strong passion. I think a lot of us mountain people equate our experiences in the mountains with like the level of like religion and really, really profound spiritual experiences. And I think a lot of people, even whether you're religious or not, can like relate to that feeling,
I think it is poignant that you brought in this kind of sense of like a religious experience, which I think a lot of people would agree with that do outdoor recreation. I also there's something really appealing about this idea that you're saying that's like, we can have these different political spectrums, we can have these different lifestyles, but like that the nature is what brings us together. Like this planet, this thing that we love is what brings it together. It's poetic and I like it, and you're selling me, but I'm curious, how high on like the voting priority is outdoor recreation, is nature protection to the average person? Like, even if we both love it, at the end of the day, I'm curious, and I don't think necessarily you have the answer to this, you're not a political pollster or something, but I'd be curious, like, how many people could we really rally on this touchstone of like, let's protect the natural places we recreate in? Or if that's just like one person's going to protect their natural recreations, but they hate all their other policies. Like, are they going to vote for that person? I don't know. What do you guys think?
I mean, I think that's the biggest challenge. Like you said, I'm not a political analyst or a pollster or anything, but with everything I've looked at and researched with alongside POW, that is the challenge, is to make climate a single voter issue, to make it an overarching unifying issue, to have a world where climate can really truly exist on both sides of the aisle and not be a partisan issue, I think is what really needs to happen to move the needle. And I think that's where I come back again to this idea of 50 million, this kind of outdoor state we're starting to talk about, in that 50 million people, it's bigger than any state in the union. It's certainly bigger than any swing state. And if you were to compare, if we want the outdoor state to be this huge political movement, if we were to compare that to an established movement that we think of as very effective, like the NRA is 3 million really active members. So if we could tap in just a portion of the outdoor state, that 50 million, there is potential to be that political juggernaut to affect that issue. I mean, I think that as people who are, for me, climate is my number one issue. And I think it's really hard because I don't think right now it is. There's a lot of issues in the world and it's really crazy out there. And it's hard for me to even say what should be your number one issue. But if this, I think there is tremendous power in the number that exists here. And I think the reason we haven't ever seen, and the finances behind it, if the outdoor industry can start playing in this arena and influencing policies and political decision makers and all the stuff the way the pharmaceutical industry and the fossil fuel industry does, there's tremendous potential there. And also, again, like if you look at this problem more from the financial side of things, if we lose this industry that's double the size of the fossil fuel extraction industry, what are the trickle down economics of that? Like even if you don't want to base this decision on the fact that the polar bears are dying, right? Like I care about that, but even if you don't care about that, or that's not relatable to you, I think like the US economy is relatable to all voters, even in a global sense, right? So I think that to me, it's not as much just this like, oh, kumbaya, let's all go to the campfire and sing songs and hold hands and get along. It's like, no. If we can actually unify, we have tremendous power potential here that is completely untapped right now. Like that's the part about it to me that's really motivating and inspiring and like gives me that courage to tattoo hypocrite on my forehead and put it on the internet for the whole world to look at, because I think that there's tremendous potential there. And I think the more that we can learn about why we think the way we are, what the solutions are, where the power potential lies that's not being tapped yet, like those are inspiring things to me. And again, like I'm not going to win anybody on the edges, right? I'm not, but I'm hoping I can give some people in the middle, maybe just a way to open up their mind to think a little differently, to start having these conversations, to lay that groundwork. Like I can't change the world with a 26-minute documentary on YouTube, right? That's not going to happen. But I hope that like one thing I've noticed in all the screenings that we've done or people that have watched the movie, like immediately just this conversation just ignites, kind of like the conversation we're having where it's like, yeah, but what about this? And did you think about this? And I never thought about this. And I think like those conversations, like that was my goal with the film. It has been trying for sure to put it online and face the criticism and just face troll culture. But then when I hear these conversations happening, like that to me is like, okay, like maybe that was something, someone's having a conversation from a different perspective than they've had before. Maybe someone's willing to engage in this conversation when they haven't been willing to before.
Yeah, I think that's all pretty spot on. And I like the way you frame this too, Siobhan, with just where does this rank in your priorities? I think for a lot of people, it probably isn't the top thing, but there is a lot of sympathy too. Like one of the things I think has the most potential for, I think if people left of center approaching climate can relax on hunting a little bit, I think that is huge. I think things like Ducks Unlimited, super important organization. Have you ever seen that show Meat Eater on Netflix?
No, I haven't, but I've heard about it.
Stephen Ranella is like pretty thoughtful guy about hunting, and he's also on Joe Rogan, and they're talking about hunting, and it isn't hunting from just like pure macho eat red meat because it makes you a testosterone filled alpha male. There's a strong sense of we have to preserve this. There's invasive species that are taking over some of these environments and being quite destructive, and we care about this, but they're just approaching it from such a different angle. And this is kind of like the relative middle class, who's cooler thing I was talking about with my parents and our neighbors growing up. I think there's also just a similar cultural inability to communicate on this, where if you could relax the hunting thing a little bit, I think people could probably see conversations like that for what they are, as a generally positive conservationist orientation that could be an ally or at least a fellow traveler.
Oh, it
But
should be
some
an
of
ally for sure.
the
The hook and bullet community are the original conservationists. They started conservation as we know it in America. And I think people don't realize that.
Teddy
And
Roosevelt and like people like that.
totally.
Yeah.
And I think it can be seen as extractionary, sure. All outdoor recreation is extractionary in some form. But I think that you'll never, in my experience, you'll never meet someone that's more in touch with the natural environment around them than a hunter. Like those guys know what's going on in their environment much more than like your random mountain biker, for example. You know, so I think that is exactly like I'm using the motorized community, but I think like you could place in the hook and bullet industry and community as well for like, we need to be on the same team, you guys. Like we want the same things, you know?
Yeah, it's like how do you do that? Because I think part of it is there's a really strong, they're almost like just different like moral tribes of people, and they don't communicate much. But I think the overlap is potentially there, but it's way more fun to split into teams and try to fight each other than I think it is to try to learn another language, which is notoriously difficult and time consuming. But I think there's a there, just how many people are willing to do that. And it's just not as fun as arguing on the internet, which is for
But
some.
I just want to come back to this idea of like, hello, we've been brainwashed to do this, to like big companies have spent millions, if not billions of dollars to strengthen those divides and to create that guilt and shame in all of us. And I think that that's something like, again, just like to flag of like, there's other things at play here. You know, I think a really cool place to go start is Naomi Oreskes, the woman I filmed. Her first book and that became a movie, Merchants of Doubt, goes through how the tobacco industry, or like the fossil fuel industry, watched what the tobacco industry did with public misinformation and was like, let's hire those guys. And they did. And like, that's how this whole came to be. Like, I think that like this idea of like, oh, it's so fun to fight with each other. Like, why are we thinking like, can we even just for a second?
It's way older than that. That's
sure.
True, but this is
It's true.
like,
I was gonna say the same thing. I think there's like a human nature. I don't know if it's tribalism or the sense of like, what I'm doing is right. And therefore, if you're doing something different, it has to inherently be wrong, which I think we know is not true, or at least some civilized part of our brain knows that's not true. I wonder what you say to people who point to like collective action, not only in politics, which by the way, I love that that's the bead you've tied together, because there's so little action, I would say, collective action on politics, and there is so much ground to be gained there. I wonder what people say when it's like, well, what if everybody flew one less flight? What if everybody did meatless Mondays? You know, what if everybody, like, is there a role then in your mind for personal action like that in a collective sense?
I think absolutely it's a yes and situation. I just think that when you actually talk to the experts and stack up the stats of collective individual actions versus collective systemic actions, like what we're up against is just still so big that, you know, I don't know the actual statistics behind a worldwide meatless Monday. The reality is that that's still a privilege. It's not available to everybody, right? And so I think that this idea of collective action being more important than collective systemic political action, it's just not factually sound statistically, nor is it realistic. I think there's a realism part of this here too. You know, it's just not realistic. And now I know it sounds crazy to think that it's realistic to affect our government for whatever direction. I know that sounds crazy too. But the reality is that like every time I interact with, go to a talk from, do research alongside someone who's in climate solutions, a scientist in climate solutions, their number one answer to this question is that political will is the only thing that solves this problem in the time frame that we need to solve it in. So I think, again, it's
So
not,
how do we make it cool then, Amy?
I don't know.
Is
I'm
it like
trying.
we had a surf company on and they were like, just slap a surfer on it and already it's cooler. Is there a way we can just like slap a skier or a snowboarder on these like these political events and be like, it's cooler now.
I
Come
mean,
give a shit.
be it as it may, like when with Protect Our Winters, when we go to DC and we have a group of Olympians and world traveled athletes and Conrad Anchor, and we do get meetings, I think like easier because, oh, that's cool. I want to talk to Conrad Anchor, or I want to talk to Jimmy Chin, you know?
I want to talk to Jimmy Chin. Shit, good.
Right. We all want to talk to Jimmy Chin. But like, I think that, yeah, it is like that is my challenge, and we're not there yet. And I think that, like, you know, in my community, no, this conversation, this idea of like the hypocrisy, the perceived hypocrisy and all this, the hypocrisy issue has always been something that's been like swept over or not talked about or not directly addressed or just brought up in the DMs. Or I think that, like, to me, just putting it out in the open, like, yeah, I'm a hypocrite. Even if you're a vegan, you're probably a hypocrite in some part of your life. Like, okay, cool. Let's de-weaponize that word. Now what? Like, what, you know, I'm going to do this thing. And what's the worst thing you're going to say? Oh, you're going to call me a hypocrite because I told you to vote. And then I also went heli skiing last year. Like, okay, that's fine. Call me a hypocrite, because it is probably hypocritical. The issue is hypocritical. The issue is imperfect. The solutions are imperfect. Like, life is imperfect. Like, you know, like any time in my life I strive for perfection, I wind up paralyzing myself, you know. And it's same in my life as an athlete. There is no perfect line. There's no perfect day. There's no perfect run. Like, so many days that I face in the backcountry skiing are terribly imperfect, but I don't go home and quit skiing. You know, I just don't. I keep going because maybe I'm a psycho, sure, but like, there's that progress there, you know, and that perfection is that it's not real, and there's hypocrisy in every walk of our lives. So how do we get to the point where we're okay with that, you know?
I gotta quote something at you. I think this is the most quoted thing from the show in its entire run. And I swear I'm a way bigger poser. This makes me sound like I'm super religious, and that this is not what is happening right now. But Dostoevsky has this line where he says, prayer doesn't exist to change the mind of God. It exists to change the person praying. And I don't want to like let myself off the hook from considering, even if the actions results are negligible in the grand scheme of things, me making a choice that I think is moral, even if I'm the only person that knows about it, I think that can be meaningful to people, and it can bring joy and still be an important thing. I don't want to give people permission to say, well, this isn't going to change anything, so why not do the more convenient thing that is less good for the climate or something like that. I think Naomi makes a good point in the film. She says, like, don't like hold yourself to such a standard that you're making yourself miserable, essentially, and that's not good for anyone. But I also want people to find ways to make moral choices that can bring joy. I don't want to remove that agency either.
No, but that exists, you know, like, do you think about carpooling? Do you think about being efficient with whatever mode of transportation you're using? Sure. But I want to make sure that, like, you know, there's a primary ballot sitting on my kitchen table right now. I think making sure I fill that out is as important as beating myself up if I missed a carpool to the mountain tomorrow, you know? And what's even more important is, can I make sure that my 20 closest friends also fill out their primary ballot, you know? I just want to take the emphasis away from just who's president. I think who's president is really important. And I think you're correct that those decisions are made in these very bizarre margins. And if you want to go way down that deep end of depending where you live, if it's worth changing your registration and sure. But it's not really about making sure you know who's president. Like, I want to make sure I know, like, one of the most important people on your ballot when it comes to climate is your county commissioner. How many people know who their county commissioner is? County commissioners have a tremendous amount of power and influence without a lot of oversight, especially when it comes to environmental policies. That person's really important on your ballot. Let's make it cool to talk about your county commissioner. Like, what's going on all the way down, and how does that drive things? Like, I think we get really wrapped up in voting for two very, very old men, right? And yes, both of them could have tremendous impact one way or the other on what happens in regards to climate change? Absolutely. But that's not it. Like, that's not citizenship. Citizenship isn't voting for the president. Citizenship is knowing what's going on civically in your community around you. And that's all the way down.
I mean to laugh at you, but the idea of let's make it cool to know who your county commissioner is. Like, could you say a less cool thing? You're a professional skier.
I'm trying to make it cool. Let's slap a surfer on it. Let's get all the surfers to know who their county commissioner is. Ready, set, go.
Lenny on, slap him on there.
Kai Lenny was at my film at the Coast Film Festival, and one of the coolest compliments I got, because I didn't really know how the film would land on someone like Kai Lenny, it's so snow specific. He was like, that was awesome, and that was really inspiring, and it inspires me to create these waves in like the surf community. Like, this is literal Kai Lenny, and I'm just like fangirling, right? I'm like, oh my god, it's Kai Lenny. Be cool, be cool, be cool. But yeah, I don't know. I think that it's altruistic, but like, it has to be, right? Like the quote that I keep over quoting right now, it was said to me at this some talk called like climate optimism or something, which kind of makes you roll your eyes. Pessimism is lazy. That's just the fact of the matter. Pessimism is lazy. And like, we don't get to be pessimistic and lazy in this issue. And like, in the community that I come from, we're not lazy people. We go out into the mountains, like seeking discomfort and long walks and hard things. And I go skiing in the rain. And like, I'm not a lazy person. My community are not lazy people. Like, pessimism is lazy. And so like, we don't get to like, how do you stay optimistic? Well, this is what we have to do.
Where can people get involved? Shout out some resources here.
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest resources right now is Protect Our Winters. They have, if you go to their website, they have this thing, Join Team POW. It's just a sign up. It taps you into their newsletters, and they have all these really cool resources on the website. Everything from like reading and listening and watching lists to, they have these things called Crux Academies. Like, if you want to learn how to be a climate advocate, you can take these online courses called Crux Academies. And it taps you into just a lot of resources where you can take it as far as you want to go. They have a 501c4 coalition that helps and activates, it's an election year, so they'll have voter guidebooks, all those different resources for how you can be a citizen in your own community, vote all the way down ballot, get resources to learn more, like, hey, I want to learn more about this individual action versus systemic thing. If you go to the POW website through Team POW, there's a whole list of resources and places you can dive as deep as you want to go. And obviously, I encourage everybody to listening to watch the film. It's called The Hypocrite. It's on Teton Gravity Research's YouTube page, and just open your mind to the ideas that might exist there and the conversations that might spark like amongst your friends in your community. I think that's my hope, is to further these conversations like we're having right now, like where we didn't solve anything, right? But we had a conversation. I got some new ideas, like, I think that's the hope.
No, thanks for being here. I think the way that you produced this film is very courageous. And I think the messy middle is the place to hang out on most of these things. And I think people who have found a really convenient binary answer in many of these things are not perhaps as helpful as maybe they suppose. So I respect the way that you conducted this, and I hope the backlash. Kai Lenny likes it. I'll take a lot of trolls if I
just put that on the cover.
Yeah, that's fine.
P.S. Kai Lenny liked it.
Yeah, so like 1,000 trolls, 10,000 trolls. I don't know what the conversion ratio, how many Kai Lennys does it take, blah, blah, blah. But whatever. Thank you for doing what you do. Links to all of those things are in the show notes. And thanks, Siobhan, for helping co-host. And thanks for being here, Amy.
Thank you guys for having me on the show, and thanks for the conversation.
Thank you so much for listening. If you could please subscribe and give us a great rating and review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify, that'd be much appreciated. It helps us get our content out to more people. You can sign up for our newsletter at nori.com, follow us on social media, and we will catch you next time.